First of all, I want to congratulate NASA and SpaceX for a successful launch yesterday of their Crew Dragon on Falcon 9 rocket to the International Space Station. I think they're scheduled to dock there shortly. And I don't want to take anything away from that, but you know what really grinds my gears? NASA's Artemis program. And I don't know how closely you've been following NASA and the Artemis program, but basically this is supposed to be the successor to the Apollo program. You know, Apollo and Artemis. And there's a lot of reasons somebody could be upset with the Artemis program. I'm going to touch on some of them briefly, and then I'm going to focus in on my main reason that I'm upset about NASA's Artemis program. I mean, the first reason has got to be the SLS. And the SLS is the Space Launch System, or as some people call it, the Senate Launch System. This is the rocket, the heavy lift launch vehicle that's supposed to be the successor to the space shuttle. And it's basically the space shuttle stack. You know, the external tank and the boosters with some engines, but without the space shuttle. And, you know, this is a pretty obvious idea. It's been kicking around as long as the space shuttle has existed. You know, people wanted more payload capacity, and they were like, you know, if we don't need to bring anything back, let's just put all cargo and shoot it into space. And we'll get more payload capacity than the space shuttle, which, you know, its only purpose is to come back. So, not very efficient. It seems pretty obvious to reconfigure the shuttle stack as an expendable super heavy lift launch vehicle, somewhat in the same category as the Saturn V in terms of capability. And it would have been easy to justify this if you had proposed it during the shuttle era as like a complement to the capabilities of the shuttle, an enhancement of the capabilities of the shuttle, or if you had proposed it right as the shuttle was retiring, you know, as the quickest, cheapest way to get back into action, doing something in space. You know, you could have made the argument then that, well, we already have this technology that we've developed. We already have the production lines for it. You know, it's old technology, obviously. So what we don't save on the launch costs for each launch, the recurring costs by using old technology, you know, we'll at least save on the upfront cost of development and in time getting back into space, you know, for a modest sum in a short time. And we can develop something better for the next generation, right? So you could have made that case then, but that was 16 years ago when that decision was made, and they've already spent tens of billions of dollars on this thing and still have yet to fly it. And they started it once as the Ares program, which is basically the same thing but a little bit less retarded, and then they canceled it because it was behind schedule and over budget, and then they restarted it again as the SLS, and that's where we are now. It's just about to fly, supposedly. But there's so many ridiculous things about the SLS. For one thing, on the bottom of the core stage, which is a space shuttle external tank, essentially, you have 4 space shuttle main engines. The space shuttle had 3. This has 4. But whereas the space shuttle flew back and reused its engines, they were designed for 100 reuses. These expensive, sophisticated, high-performance engines are being used on an expendable rocket one time, including engines, historic engines that were originally designed for the space shuttle and flew to space on the space shuttle. You know, cue Indiana Jones. Those engines belong in a museum. But, you know, they have actually started a contract to supply more of these engines for $150 million each. Now the SLS, which is basically just a shuttle stack, the expendable bits, largely expendable bits of a shuttle stack, is meant to cost $1 billion to $2 billion, which is 4 times the cost of a shuttle launch. That makes no sense whatsoever. There's obviously a tremendous amount of pork and corruption and graft going on there. just like an obscene amount, a criminal amount of pork and graft and corruption, like way more than normal, even for a government project, even for like a, big defense contractor type project. And a big part of that is the cost of these dang engines. During the shuttle era, they cost $40 million each. Now they cost $150 million each. And this is after the contractor that supplies them has supposedly modernized them and simplified them, for expendable applications. Now, how does the cost go up almost 4 times when you modernize and simplify something? Something doesn't add up there. $150 million per engine. You get a whole Falcon Heavy launch for that. So you get 4 whole Falcon Heavy launches for the price of 1 SLS and get a lot more payload into orbit. Or just the price of the engines on an SLS, mind you. You could get 20 Falcon Heavy launches, 10 to 20, for the price of the whole SLS. It's nuts. It makes absolutely no sense. There's absolutely no way to defend it whatsoever. The cost of this rocket and the cost of these engines, totally out of line, like to an outrageous extent. But that's not the most infuriating thing about the Artemis program. Another really infuriating thing is this Lunar Orbital Platform Gateway, LOP-G they call it. And this is a small space station they want to build around the moon. And this thing also is going to cost tens of billions of dollars. Only it's completely pointless, completely useless, and a total waste. NASA says they want experience operating in deep space away from Earth orbit, to learn how to go to Mars or whatever. But they've been doing that in Earth orbit for decades. They don't need any more experience. And if they did, there would be no reason not to just do it in low Earth orbit. The only thing that happens when you do it in lunar orbit instead is it's more costly. It's harder to get there. You can get less payload there for the same cost. It takes more time. It's less safe because if anything happens, you can't just abort back to Earth. There's no upside. Yes, it's more realistic in the sense that it's more danger, but everything you want to do in deep space, you could just simulate in low Earth orbit. You don't have to add the actual danger and cost and inconvenience of that by putting it further out. Totally pointless. And as far as having a space station in lunar orbit, there's really no reason for that. I mean, there's not really anything to do in lunar orbit. There might be something to do on the moon that makes going to the moon worthwhile. Study something on the moon, look for minerals, study planetary geology, whatever. You could even do astronomy on the far side of the moon and be shielded from Earth's radio signals. So there's stuff, maybe worthwhile reasons to go back to the moon, but we already have spacecraft in orbit around the moon. We don't need astronauts in orbit around the moon. There's no rationale for it. And you don't need a space station around the moon in order to land on the moon. The Apollo missions didn't need that. And even the Artemis missions, they were making this gateway, which some people call the toll booth, because all it does is add cost and complexity. It doesn't contribute anything of value. They were making this gateway mission critical for the Artemis missions, but they've decided, well, they might not have it ready in time for 2024 for the first landing that they want to do. So if it's not ready, they'll just do the landing without the gateway. They'll just have the capsule and the lander rendezvous in Earth orbit, and the astronauts will go from one to the other, and then the lander will go down to the surface. No gateway required. So, which basically just reveals that the whole thing is totally pointless. And again, tens of billions of dollars wasted for no apparent good reason. We already have a space station in Earth orbit. If we need to retire it and build another station in Earth orbit, that makes much more sense than building one in lunar orbit, where it's going to be smaller, it's going to be harder to get to, it's going to be more expensive, and it's going to be more dangerous for no apparent benefit. So, but even the gateway isn't the thing that is most infuriating about the Artemis program. The most infuriating thing about the Artemis program is that the mission goal is to land the next man and the first woman on the moon. And this is just a politically and ideologically motivated stunt. This is a politically correct publicity stunt. And it's a way to take something which fundamentally isn't all that interesting or new. I mean, this was done 50 years ago. They're not breaking any new ground here. There might be some legitimate reasons to go to the moon, but it's not a first by any stretch of the imagination. And they're trying to make it a first by adding an intersectional category and doing it in accordance with some kind of feminist agenda. I mean, they're going to do this with every intersectional category. After the first woman, there's going to be the first gay, and then the first whatever. Like, keep multiplying the categories, and this is something they do to try to make everything a cheap first. But, there's also obviously an equality agenda and a feminist agenda here. And it's just totally stupid. It's totally stupid. It's not plausible. It's not believable. Because let's face it, I mean, women are not that interested in space. That's a fact. Most women are not interested in space, and most people who are interested in space are not women. So there's no reason on earth to suppose that a woman is equally likely to get, one of the top slots on a prestigious mission as a man. There's no reason to assume that. Even if men and women were equally capable in every way, which they're not, there's definitely a lack of interest, a pronounced difference in interest in space and space exploration and space missions. And so there's no reason to assume that a woman would be equally likely to get that spot, just from motivation alone. And so declaring that a woman must have that spot is really obnoxious and improbable. And, it endangers the mission and it endangers the man because, like I said, even if men and women were equally capable in every meaningful dimension, just by restricting it to saying, well, it has to be a woman, you're automatically excluding the possibility that the best candidate for both of those positions on that spacecraft are men, which statistically speaking can happen. So just by narrowing it down to, well, it has to be a woman, you're automatically restricting your pool of candidates for that position and automatically ensuring that you're most likely going to get a less qualified candidate. But as a matter of fact, because of the differences in motivation and interest, it's much worse than that. And because of the likely differences in ability, it's even probably much worse again. So, this poor guy is going to have to do this mission, which even though it's not new, it's not interesting, it's still difficult and dangerous, with a less qualified affirmative action sidekick who, he's never going to hear the end of it from his wife either. She's going to be like, you're going off to the moon for a week with who? I mean, there's just, it's just infuriating. And this whole concept is nonsense because exploration has always been a masculine domain. Always, always, always. Never in the history of the world have a group of women gotten together and built a ship and sailed off into the unknown, whereas men have done stuff like that fairly frequently. And part of the explanation for that, comes in with how men and women achieve status and how they achieve respect and renown within a society. And women basically get it by default because of what they have, because of what they can do, because of their status as, the limited supply in the sexual marketplace. They're the reproductive bottleneck for a human population. And so what they have is always in demand, and there's always a limited supply. And so they get a lot of status by default. And so they can basically just ride on that and play it safe. And they have no need, to prove themselves or to make a name for themselves or to take big risks to acquire status. Men do. Men have to do all that. Men have to make a name for themselves. They have to prove themselves. They have to acquire their status somehow. And one of the ways men have done that, some men have done that in the past, is by exploration. And it's tremendously risky. You know, when Magellan set off in his round the world trip, well, he never made it. He died in the Philippines. But it was 5 ships that set off with over 250 crew, and 1 ship returned with 16 crew. And everybody was so impressed, they were like, let's do it again, right? But women aren't going to take those kind of risks, and they don't have to. So historically, they have not. They never have. They never will. This whole thing is a false, politically motivated agenda that's basically fake. It's all make-believe. It's a charade. It's a play. It's it's staged, basically. They're staging a moon landing. The fact that they're doing it on the moon doesn't fucking change that. It's still fake. It's just totally nonsense to shoehorn women into this role. Like, not many of them even want it. I'm sure there are a few that do, but they're not as qualified. Just going on statistical probabilities. And I'm not even saying it's a terrible idea to send women to the moon. We're going to have to do it eventually, especially, once we want a self-sustaining population there. We're never going to have a large one, but there might be a reason to have a small outpost on the moon that has natural population increase. And for that, you want women, because maybe it's cheaper to get people on the moon by, having them born there instead of transporting them there. And it's going to have to happen eventually. But in the exploration phases, in the initial phases, there's no rationale whatsoever for women to be involved in that. And there are scarcely any that are qualified or willing. I'd say fine. If they're qualified, let them, but with the understanding that there aren't many who are. I'd throw them that bone. I don't think it's necessary. I don't even think it's helpful, but it doesn't cost much to throw them that bone. But as far as this thing of insisting that it be a man and a woman for the sake of equality, screw that. What a bunch of nonsense. What a waste. We're already wasting $100 billion on this thing. We're going to add that to it as well. That aspect to it, that dimension to it. It makes my blood boil. And it's like that remake of Ghostbusters, right? Where they took a classic masculine movie, and it was masculine in every conceivable way, right? You have scientists, right? Engineers who quit their jobs to start a speculative venture as entrepreneurs, developing technology, doing battle with dark forces to save civilization. Everything about that scenario is masculine. And they take it and they just shove a bunch of women into this utterly implausible role, and it sucks and everybody hates it and nobody goes and sees it, and it wastes $100 million. Well, take that times 1,000 because it's $100 billion, and that's NASA's Artemis program. So, that's my 2 cents on that. And, backing out a little bit to the wider context, the sooner we do this thing that we have to do anyway and, shake things up and make some changes around here, the more money we can save on this boondoggle to do something actually useful. And whether that be something besides space or whether that be something useful and new and interesting and exciting in space, which would be my preference because I'm a huge space nerd. I love this stuff. I just don't want it to be stupid and politically motivated drivel, in your face, feminist agenda bullcrap. That's basically like Ghostbusters 2016, but 1,000 times stupider. So let's get this stuff done that we have to do. So, we can reorganize priorities and actually do some interesting things in space. Or even not, maybe we're to the point that we've got people who can do space and we don't necessarily need the government to do it for us. I mean, it'd be nice. It'd be nice for the government to take a sensible leading role on that because they have resources. But if they're not going to do it, there's some people who will. So, until later.